You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. Today, episode 146, The Battle of Hubbardton. Last week, we followed the British down Lake Champlain as they captured the remaining American fleet at Skenesborough and forced the Americans to abandon Fort Anne. At the same time that was happening, the main American force from Ticonderoga was retreating through the woods toward Castleton. General Arthur St. Clair marched his main column of about 2,000 men away from Fort Ticonderoga in the early pre-dawn hours of July 6, 1777. His soldiers traveled down the Hubbardton Road, which was little more than a stump-filled path cut through the woods leading away from the fort. The men stumbled through the dark. Many of the soldiers had panicked and run into the woods after General Fermoy set his house on fire atop Mount Independence, thus alerting the enemy to the American retreat. Many of those men eventually regrouped and joined up with the column along the way as they retreated from the fort. St. Clair organized the column with the Continentals in front, militia units in the middle, and more Continental units in the rear. He kept the militia in the middle because he feared they might break and run. Several company commanders had informed St. Clair the day before that their enlistments were over and that they felt no compunction to remain with the army as it retreated. Since they expected a British pursuit, St. Clair put some of his most capable units in the rear of the column to form a rear guard. Colonel Seth Warner commanded the Green Mountain Boys, who were mostly local to this area and were defending their homes. Warner and many of his men had been with the force that originally captured Ticonderoga in 1775 under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. When the regiment joined the Continental Army a few months later, they voted Warner as their commander and ousted Ethan Allen. These men had participated in the invasion of Quebec and the subsequent retreat before ending up back at Fort Ticonderoga. Warner had brought 800 militia to the fort from the self-proclaimed Independent Republic of Vermont just days before the decision to abandon the fort. Most of this militia had dispersed. In the rear guard, he commanded a regiment of less than 200 men. The head of St. Clair's column reached the small town of Hubbardton, which was actually just a few farmhouses, sometime in the afternoon of July 6th. The men had already marched about 17 miles from Mount Independence after spending the previous night preparing to abandon the fort. The men were exhausted and demoralized. St. Clair gave his men a few hours' rest at Hubbardton, but after learning that enemy Indian warriors had passed through the area before they had arrived, St. Clair determined that his force should continue on to Castleton, about 7 miles further to the south. He left Colonel Warner's regiment in Hubbardton to await the arrival of the rear guard that was still marching there. To supplement Warner's force, St. Clair also left the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment, commanded by Colonel Nathan Hale, no relation to the captain of the same name who had already given his one life for his country. Colonel Hale had been with the army since the Battle of Lexington. He was a veteran of Bunker Hill. His regiment had also participated in the Quebec campaign and retreat, then marched south in time to participate in the battles of Trenton and Princeton, before moving back north to Ticonderoga. His regiment of about 360 soldiers was highly experienced and battle-hardened. These two regiments awaited the rearguard regiment, the 11th Massachusetts, commanded by Ebenezer Francis. Francis was an up-and-coming officer who had served with distinction during the siege of Boston. It was only a few months earlier that he had received his promotion to colonel and led the 11th Massachusetts to Fort Ticonderoga. The large regiment of 420 Continentals formed the bulk of the rear guard once they arrived in Hubbardton. Although Warner commanded the smallest of the three regiments, he was the most senior colonel among the leaders, which put him in overall command. Sinclair left Warner with orders to wait for Colonel Francis, then march immediately to Castleton to catch up with the main column. Instead, when Francis's regiment arrived in late afternoon, Warner decided to rest for the night and leave at dawn the following morning. It's not entirely clear what Warner's motives were in disobeying the orders to march. It could be that he was still awaiting some stragglers that he expected to march in overnight. It could also be that he feared losing men in a nighttime march. Most of these men had been awake for the last 36 hours and had been hard at work loading equipment and marching that whole time. A night march would mean that men would almost certainly fall out of line in the dark and fall asleep, making them easy prey for the advancing enemy or for the Indians prowling the woods. Instead, Warner deployed his 3 regiments in a defensive position in case the enemy approached before they were ready to leave in the morning. Knowing the enemy was in the area, he set out pickets and placed his 1,000 or so men in defensive lines where they could sleep, but then, if needed, wake and be in position already to fight in a moment's notice. Only a few miles away, General Simon Fraser had led his British regulars, along with Indian and Loyalist scouts totaling about 850 men, in pursuit of the Americans. Fraser had marched his troops across the footbridge across Lake Champlain only hours after the last Americans had left on July 6th. Although his force was smaller than the American column, he felt confident that he could capture the retreating and demoralized garrison if he could catch up with them. Fraser also wanted to stay ahead of General Friedrich von Riedesel, who commanded a force of over 1,000 German troops. This was the division that had been too slow to cut off the American retreat, but was now also in pursuit of the retreating column. Riedesel outranked Fraser and could take command of the entire operation if the two forces combined. Riedesel got frustrated with the slow pace of his own column. He took a small division of Jaegers and rode ahead to find Fraser. By early evening, he had caught up with Fraser's column. Although Riedesel was the senior officer, he did not try to take command. Instead, he said only that he was there to assist. Riedesel said that his soldiers were exhausted and needed to rest for the night. However, he allowed Fraser to take his regulars a few miles closer to the rear guard at Hubbardton before they also camped for the night. As aggressive as Fraser was, he was not ready to lead his exhausted men into a night raid in unknown territory. At the same time, he did not want the American column to escape. After a few hours' rest, Fraser roused his men from sleep in the middle of the night and had them ready to march by 3 a.m. The first few hours of marching in the dark were slow and difficult, but by dawn, Fraser's Indian and Tory scouts encountered Continental pickets near Hubbardton. Fraser knew that his German reinforcements under von Riedesel were still a few hours behind him. He could have waited for the reinforcements to arrive. Charging in without those reinforcements was a dangerous move. There were hills all through the area which the Americans could use to ambush the regulars. Despite the risks, Fraser opted to charge the Americans and engage them. Although alerted by the pickets, the Americans were still in camp when the British attacked. Pickets engaged the enemy, who exchanged volleys as both sides attempted to form their lines. The Americans had only hoped to delay the British assault as they continued to pull back. Both sides stood their ground and fired, leading to dozens of casualties on each side. About the same time fighting began, Colonel Warner received a message from General Sinclair telling him that the British had captured the American baggage and wounded at Skenesborough, and that Warner should bring his men immediately to Rutland, further to the east. From there, the column would move south through the woods and link up with General Philip Schuyler's forces. With the British attacking, though, the Americans could not simply march away. Colonel Francis formed the main line behind a stone wall. He repelled several British charges with devastating volleys. General Fraser personally led a company of light infantry in an attempt to break the American line, but the American lines held. Next, Fraser sent his grenadiers against the American left flank. This, if successful, would have cut off the American line of retreat. However, it was also risky because deploying these reinforcements against the American left had weakened his own left flank and risked his own army being surrounded. The Americans advanced on the British left and threatened to break the British lines. By this time, though, General Riedesel was only a few miles away, and he was able to observe the firefight from a nearby hill. He rushed a few companies of Jaegers on the double to the scene of the battle in hopes of shoring up the British left flank and preventing the Americans from breaking the enemy line. Much of this battle took place in heavy woods, meaning that it was almost impossible to know what was happening in other parts of the battlefield. Colonel Hale's regiment had taken the brunt of the first British assault and was mostly gone by now. Some had been captured, many had fled into the woods and were hiding as the British overwhelmed the area. According to British sources, at one point about 60 Patriot soldiers approached a British line with their muskets clubbed. That is, when a soldier holds his weapon so that the stock is pointing up and the barrel pointed toward the ground. This was universally understood at the time as meaning the soldier was surrendering. The British allowed the soldiers to advance to within about 30 feet. Then, suddenly, the Americans turned their muskets toward the enemy, fired, and ran back into the woods. The actions grew fierce as the grenadiers pushed the American left flank. The Americans refused to pull back, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. Warner's Green Mountain Boys pulled back across a field to a low stone wall. From there, they dared the grenadiers to charge, knowing that they would take heavy losses in doing so. As the American left flank pulled back, the right flank under Colonel Francis advanced against the weakened British line on that side of the battle. For a time, it appeared that the Americans might surround the British regulars and force a surrender. But then events took a different turn. The arrival of Riedesel's Jaegers provided the British with the necessary reinforcements to hold up the American advance. At the same time, as Colonel Francis attempted to rally the Americans, a British volley struck him down, killing him. With the loss of Francis and the arrival of the German reinforcements, the American line began to falter. Colonel Hale found himself in between British and German forces. His men began to scatter, and Hale and about 70 of his men were taken prisoner. More of Riedesel's soldiers were arriving at the battle scene, giving the British the support they needed. Colonel Warner, the only American commander still fighting in the field at this point, observed another group of Germans working their way behind his lines in an attempt to cut off retreat and surround his remaining forces. He yelled out to his men, "Meet me in Manchester," by which he meant it was time to flee as best they could and regroup back in the town of Manchester. The remaining Green Mountain Boys, along with the remnants of the 2nd New Hampshire and the 11th Massachusetts, scattered into the woods, each man attempting to evade the enemy and escape as best they could. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the Battle of Hubbardton was over. The British and Germans held the field. About an hour later, the British and Germans were still regrouping and surveying the battlefield. They came across the body of Colonel Francis and began going through his papers. Suddenly, a rifle shot rang out. An American sniper had taken a long-distance shot at the group of officers and then disappeared into the woods. A British captain named Shrimpton fell dead, the final casualty of the Battle of Hubbardton. Estimates of American casualties vary greatly. Estimates of battle deaths range from about 40 to over 150. Wounded estimates range from about 100 to over 450. Another 230 to 290 became prisoners of war. That's a pretty substantial casualty rate for an American force of less than 1,000 men. The British and Germans suffered losses of just under 200 killed or wounded, the bulk of those coming from Fraser's smaller force that had engaged the enemy first. The Germans only reported about 10 killed and 14 wounded. If the British had taken the field that day, which is to say they forced the Americans to retreat from the field. But the American rearguard action that day was never designed to hold the field. It had only been meant to delay the much larger British and German force to prevent them from catching up with Sinclair's main column of retreating Americans. In that, the American rearguard succeeded. The ground on which they fought was itself meaningless. Neither side intended to remain there, and it had no real strategic value. British General Fraser and German General von Riedesel both agreed that they should not pursue the enemy any further. They were quickly becoming detached from the main force, still at Ticonderoga, and had no idea what might be awaiting them down the road. It did not help that an afternoon rain soon turned into a downpour. The army remained in Hubbardton for the rest of the day. Soldiers spent some time searching through the woods, still rounding up hiding enemy, but mostly finding dead and wounded on the field. Despite the enemy having fled, the woods were still dangerous. One British officer reported that an American straggler had jumped out from behind a tree and pointed a musket at his head. The British officer was faster and shot the soldier. He ran over to the fallen enemy to say he hoped that he had not been hurt too badly, only to realize that his shot had killed the enemy instantly. Of course, looting bodies after a battle was always a good source of supplies. There's a story of a British soldier stripping the shoes off the body of a 16-year-old fifer. It turns out the young man had been shot in the back, but was only playing dead. He decided he would rather be taken prisoner than lose his shoes. He opened his eyes and startled the British soldier by letting him know that he was not dead and that he surrendered. An officer with the soldier ordered him to return the shoes to the boy and bring him back to camp, where doctors could attend to his wounds. Young Ebenezer Fletcher would become one of the American prisoners taken back to Fort Ticonderoga. After a few weeks, he escaped his captivity and returned home to New Hampshire. He eventually recovered from his wounds and returned to service. After spending most of the day and night at Hubbardton, the British and German forces planned to move back to catch up with Burgoyne's forces at Skenesborough, while sending a smaller detachment with prisoners back to Fort Ticonderoga. However, the continuing torrential rains the following day forced them to remain in camp for another day. The force finally departed on the morning of July 9th. After a miserable day-long march, they reached Skenesborough that evening. The British had to leave a group of wounded soldiers behind at Hubbardton who were considered too hurt to travel. There were no stretchers to carry them anywhere, and no wagons could get through the woods. They had to await stretchers sent from Fort Ticonderoga to carry back the wounded. At least some of the wounded had to linger in the woods for nearly 3 weeks. The British also buried their own dead and gave Colonel Francis the honor of being buried with them. Most of the American casualties, however, were left in the woods to rot and be eaten by the wolves. Some of their bones were still being found by locals a decade later. General Sinclair, with the main American column, heard the battle in the distance and dispatched officers to find out what was happening and return back. By the time his aides got near the battle, the shooting was already over, and the retreating soldiers told them that the American rear guard was now fleeing for their lives. By this time, Sinclair also knew that the other smaller force with the baggage had been captured or destroyed at Skenesborough, so his march to the rendezvous point at Castleton did not make much sense anymore. Instead, Sinclair took his remaining force to Rutland, further to the east and away from enemy forces. The next day, before even reaching Rutland, he rerouted again to Dorset, which was 25 miles further south. The American column arrived in Dorset on July 9th. There, Sinclair gave his men time to rest and spent a few hours writing reports for General Schuyler and others to explain why he had abandoned Fort Ticonderoga without putting up a fight. Many of the men who were feared lost from desertion or capture eventually found their way back to the army in Dorset, as men had used the cover of the woods to escape, but were still ready to rejoin the army for its next fight. The Battle of Hubbardton succeeded in preventing the British from catching up with the main column that had left Fort Ticonderoga. But the fleeing Americans were demoralized and isolated as they marched through the woods, still not entirely sure of their destination. Meanwhile, the British consolidated their gains and took control of the region. Next week, we're going to head south to Rhode Island to discuss the kidnapping of General Prescott. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show. I wanted to address something this week that's come to my attention from some of my listeners. Some of you have expressed interest in supporting the show financially, but do not want to use Patreon or PayPal because of some of their policies and their censorship of certain groups. For anyone who objects to using Patreon, I've set up an alternative place to pledge money on a monthly basis at subscribestar.com. There's a link to this on my website, and I will start putting links to it on my weekly blogs as well. I will admit that I'm still trying to figure out the details about how exactly Subscribestar works, so everything may not be fully up and running there for a few more weeks. But I hope that shortly everything that is available on Patreon will also be available on Subscribestar. As I said, it's pretty much the same thing, but it is an alternative for those who dislike using Patreon for whatever reason. Similarly, some people have expressed concerns about using PayPal as well. My PayPal account is set up to make one-time donations, and I certainly don't want to prevent anyone from sending me money who have such a desire. So, I've also set up accounts on Venmo, Zelle, and Pop Money. If anyone wants to send donations using any of those, and you probably understand how to better than I do at this point, you can send money using my email, mtroy1@yahoo.com. Again, I've added this information to the bottom of my website and will include it at the bottom of my weekly blog posts going forward as well. If anyone wants to send me money in any other way that I haven't thought of, just let me know and I'll try to figure it out. I still don't freaking understand Bitcoin, so don't expect that to be an option unless you can help me figure it out. Okay, enough about money. This week we covered the Battle of Hubbardton. This was not a full battle of opposing armies. It was the advance guard of the British Army against the rear guard of the Continental Army. However, it was a pretty sizable battle and was pretty bloody for those involved. Casualty reports vary greatly by source, but it seems somewhere that around 20% of each side was killed or wounded, and the Americans took another 20% captured. That is evidence of very intense fighting between the combatants. The fate of American leaders at Hubbardton reflects this high casualty rate. As I noted, there were 3 colonels involved. Colonel Francis was killed outright, Colonel Hale was taken prisoner, and Colonel Warner escaped. The story of Colonel Nathan Hale's imprisonment is not a pleasant one and does not reflect particularly well on the American leadership. Hale spent a couple of weeks as a prisoner at Fort Ticonderoga, after which the British released him on parole. Under the terms of the parole, Hale could not return to duty, but had to await exchange of an officer of the same rank. While on parole, General Horatio Gates issued orders that Colonel Hale be sent to Albany to face charges of cowardice and treason for his role at Hubbardton, and for alleged conversations that he had with General Burgoyne after his capture. I've never seen any evidence to substantiate these charges. The field commander that day, Colonel Warner, very much objected to the charges and praised Colonel Hale's performance. General Burgoyne also later submitted a letter confirming that he never had any conversation with Colonel Hale that discussed anything of substance. Now, it could be that General Gates considered Hale an officer who supported Gates's rival, General Schuyler, and that Gates simply wanted to put a cloud over his reputation in order to prevent him from being able to rejoin the army. As things turned out, Hale never received his court-martial. he remained at home on parole for nearly 2 years, and the Continentals never proposed any exchange for a captured British officer. In 1779, Colonel Hale had to return to British custody, which was required under the terms of his parole. The only other record I could find for him after that point was a letter that he signed with a group of other officers being held prisoners in New York City in 1780. In that letter, they pleaded with General Washington to exchange General Burgoyne for a group of lower-ranking officers. Washington never acted on that plea. A few months later, Hale became ill and died while still held as a British prisoner. Death at age 37 seems a sad ending for an officer who, by most accounts, fought bravely and whose reputation was being unfairly besmirched, quite likely for political reasons. His case was not unique. There are other examples of patriots soldiers who ended up on the receiving end of unjust charges, and we will discuss some of those in future episodes. As I said, this was a sad and unnecessary end to a good soldier. The Battle of Hubbardton does not get much undivided attention by historians because it doesn't even come into the top 3 battles of the Saratoga campaign, all of which I will be discussing in future episodes. However, Hubbardton was the first place where General Burgoyne's army got bloodied and sent the message to the British that this wasn't going to be a simple fox chase. Most books that cover the Saratoga campaign generally devote some pages to it. However, I've only found one book that really focuses on Hubbardton as its only subject, and that book is today's book recommendation of the week. It is called The Battle of Hubbardton, the Rearguard Action That Saved America. The book itself, which was first published in 2015, is rather short, less than 150 pages, not counting notes and index. However, it gets into as much detail as exists about the battle. The author goes into some considerable analysis about the geography of the battlefield itself. Dr. Ventnor has written quite a bit on the Revolution, and he runs a tour company of Revolutionary War battlefields and historic sites. And apparently he even maintains a vacation home near the Battle of Hubbardton. Earlier this year, I planned to attend a conference of the American Revolution that Dr. Ventnor hosts annually at Williamsburg, Virginia. Sadly, it was canceled due to the pandemic. Hopefully, I can make it there next year. If you want a book that focuses solely on the Battle of Hubbardton, Ventnor's book is the best place to start. My online recommendation this week is a YouTube video which provides an animated map of the Battle of Hubbardton. It is a good addition to anyone who wants to see a visual representation of what I have been trying to describe in the podcast. The video was posted by a group called Seth Warner's Regiment, which is a living history group that reenacts the regiment commanded by Colonel Warner during the Revolutionary War. If you go to YouTube and search for Battle of Hubbardton, it should be the first video that comes up. Of course, I've also included a direct link on my website at amrevpodcast.com. Incidentally, if you run that search on YouTube, the second thing that comes up in the list is a video of Dr. Ventnor, the author of today's book recommendation, talking about the battle and his book. There's a direct link to that video at the bottom of my blog post for this week as well, and you can find that at blog.amrevpodcast.com. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.